Hello friends, for today's video we're back with another new fantasy releases wrap up, and the 3 books we'll be discussing today would be Ambessa, Chosen of the Wolf, Immortal, and Grave Empire. I'll have timestamps in the description bar down below in case you'd like to skip ahead to any one specific book or reference back to them at a future date, as always, and then I'll also have links to any of these in case you'd like to check them out for yourself. I am going to start with Ambessa, Chosen of the Wolf simply because I've actually talked about this one in a couple of recent videos, and I wanted to ensure that if you've already heard me discuss it, that I can just have it be out of the way and you can skip ahead to the others. So it'll go Ambessa, Chosen of the Wolf, then we'll talk about Immortal, and then we'll talk about Grave Empire. Before jumping into specifics about Ambessa, I do want to make clear what I'm going to focus on in discussing it today versus what was focused on in the other videos that I brought up. So I did do a video about adult fantasy works with adult perspectives in them or adult protagonists, and this does have that. So if that's something you're interested in, just know that that's a factor here. But more so, I wanted to mention that I did do a more formal individual review for this one, and it remained non-spoiler, but I go more in depth with how it's connected to Arcane, as I know that's how most people have probably heard about this one, and I figured a lot of people would want to know what are some of the connections. I'll let you know now that you don't have to have watched Arcane to pick up this book if it ends up sounding like something you might want to check out for yourself, but if you are more so interested in those connections, I'll have that video linked. The reason that I didn't have that video here and rather had it on my side channel is because my side channel is dedicated to pretty much all other forms of stories besides books, so anime, manga, video games, TV shows, which includes Arcane, and because pretty much all of my Arcane content is on that channel, I actually decided, even though this is a book, that I wanted to have that over there. It just felt like it went along with that a little bit better. All that said, the reason I'm mentioning all that is so that you have that information in case it's something that you would like to look into a little bit more, but also here, I'm not going to really talk about how this is connected to Arcane because I know not everybody's watched it, not everybody's interested in watching it, but you might be interested in this as a book, so that is going to be the focus today. All that said, finally getting into what this one entails with its plot and its premise, you follow a woman named Ambessa, as the title implies, and this is, at its core, a line of succession plotline. You have the Medarda clan, and this is a group that has very much been together, united with each other. This family looks out for its own. They do have their own code of conduct and how they operate within the clan, and she specifically is somebody who ranks very high. At the beginning of the story, the person who is essentially the head of the clan is on their deathbed, and it's very important that they name who the heir is going to be before they pass away, because of the fact that they don't want there to be infighting. Not only would that be bad for the clan, but there are enemies around them all the time. It's a very cutthroat world. So if there's infighting between them, it will also likely have other things that intervene with how everything operates. It's basically going to be the disintegration of the entire clan. And this is also really significant to Ambessa because she knows that she is the person that her grandfather would choose. She just needs him to formally say it before he dies. And she also knows that another family member has some personal issues with her, and if that grandfather does not name her, that individual is going to make trouble. So she knows it's coming. She's trying to prepare. She's trying to prepare her children for this. She's trying to prepare her husband for this. And just in general, she's trying to get her army ready, the people that are going to be at her side, her trusted bodyguard. She's also kind of recruiting another individual to sort of be under her wing. She's trying to get everybody prepared because she just knows it's coming. Not unwarranted. There are definitely things that come into the picture with who is wanting the throne, we'll call it, although it's not necessarily a formal throne. But in fantasy terms, I think a lot of us are familiar with thinking of line of succession in that way. But she just had reasons to worry. So she, in some ways, is on the run while simultaneously also trying to fight and have her claim on power within this clan. Not only does she feel it's owed to her because of the fact that her grandfather was her mentor and that she always was sort of his favorite of the people in the family, but she also is somebody who matches the cutthroat nature of their world. She knows how to run things, she knows how to be a warrior, she knows how to make sacrifices, or at the very least, that's how she sees herself, and so she feels she's the ideal of what their clan is meant to represent. She also is quite capable. You see time and time again that she is willing to make certain sacrifices, and she is somebody who has a lot of physical power, but also she just kind of has this dominating nature to her. And what I thought really enriched the story and made it more interesting is that you actually get other perspectives besides her. She almost, I wouldn't go as far as to say she's an unreliable narrator, but there's almost a sense of you see her and her clan and her role within it through her eyes when you're with her as her perspective. And then you start to see other characters who think, well, it would be a lot wiser if she could solve certain things with her wit and by being clever and with a quill rather than with a sword. And if only she could embrace that, or she could see that these are my strengths. You see that through the perspective of her daughter as an example. If only she would be willing to negotiate and meet people where they are and not always turn to violence, then maybe there's a chance that things would play out differently. And you actually see that there's somewhat of a clash in ideology between her and her family members and other perspectives, which, as I stated, I feel like really fleshed the story out a lot more. At the end of the day, though, for a while, it was a kind of action-packed story that's moving from one thing to the next. And it's not that I disliked it by any means, but I was kind of waiting for there to be a little bit more for me to latch onto and to care about. And I actually think, and I know this is a silly statement, I know that if somebody's really disliking a book, that it's probably best they just DNF it. And I'm not somebody who thinks it's wrong to DNF or that I give people a hard time for DNFing or anything like that. But this is a story that I would encourage, if you're at least somewhat enjoying it, to see it through to the end, because I do feel like there are some things that happen at the end, some information that you get, that makes the entire rest of the book almost in hindsight way more interesting, and then you kind of look at everything a little bit different. And I haven't read too many books that I feel like accomplished that as well as this one did. It actually reminded me a little bit of the book Witch's Heart, which is by Genevieve Gornichek. And that one is a story where it's a similar thing. You get a little bit of information at the end and you're like, wait, oh, and then it makes you see things differently. And then you kind of want to reread it because once you have that information, you can just see all the signs along the way. So I do like that feeling, but I did feel that a lot of the book, the reading experience, as I stated, was enjoyable, but maybe not the most emotionally compelling, or maybe the intrigue could have been a little bit stronger if this hadn't been a standalone, because it is a standalone. If maybe we'd had a little bit more time with some of these characters and to have more of the moving pieces on the board, I might have been that much more invested. However, that said, I do feel like that shift in perspective that I got toward the end of it really elevated this. And it just kind of had this feeling of like a return to a certain kind of fantasy story that is not necessarily on trend these days. I felt that was somewhat true of the other League of Legends novel, Ruination, where there's just something about them that they're a satisfying fantasy standalone, perhaps not the most gutting necessarily, or thematically, maybe they're not saying the most, you know, like something like Blood Over Brighthaven is not hiding that it is very thematic, and I don't necessarily think that's true of Ambessa Chosen of the Wolf, but it was just the kind of standalone that you want to pick up when, I think a good way to categorize it is, I often talk about how I like picking up a mix of fantasy subgenres and age ranges to break up some of the more epic and intense stories. So for example, if I'm in the middle of reading the Engines of Empire story, and I finished that book, and before picking up the second one, I'm like, okay, that was epic fantasy, a lot of perspectives, a lot to dive into, so now I want to pick up a cozy fantasy, or now I want to pick up, maybe even go outside of fantasy, pick up a contemporary romance, or something like that, where you kind of want to mix it up so that you always are excited to pick the next thing up, and you don't kind of fall into a reading slump. Sorry, Luna Bear has thoughts and opinions right now about what? I don't know. I gotta go check on that. I have no idea what Luna Bear was barking at. She just rudely interrupted us. Anyway, the point I was trying to make is that I kind of feel like when it comes to the sorts of books that I like to pick up in between the more epic and intense fantasy stories, that there's only, right now, it feels like a certain kind. And I sort of just said, like, you have the cozy fantasy or maybe fantasy romance or things like that, where those are the sorts that break it up. But sometimes I want to still maintain a more epic fantasy feeling, but in a more digestible form where it doesn't feel like as much of a commitment is perhaps what I'm trying to get at. And I really feel like these books fulfill that really well. So it's not a new favorite book of all time, but I did really enjoy it. And I felt like it was a good addition to the League of Legends world. As noted before, if you're interested in potential connections and some nods to things that maybe are to come with what Arcane is going to be doing moving forward, I do feel like there are definitely some things in there that make me have some predictions, and people that know more about the League of Legends lore, I think will be able to have a lot more thoughts about that than even I can. So I'll have that video linked if you are interested in it. I liked it. I thought it was fun, and I think there's a good chance that if you're just in the mood for like a fun fantasy action-packed line of succession story, that this really delivers on that sort of setup. Switching gears quite a bit, we actually do have another standalone, but this one is very drastically different in its plot and in its execution than that one, and that would be Immortal. This is the same author who wrote Daughter of the Moon Goddess, and I think once again, something that I praised that book for that I can say is true of this one is I really feel like the author captures the setting in a very lush and beautiful way. In both of the stories, there is this sort of centering of these celestial beings or celestial kingdoms, and I really feel like the author knows how to condense that and then just have it seep into the writing in every way. There's not really a better word to describe. Everything feels celestial, and I know it's kind of a corny way to describe it, but it really is so pretty. You read it and everything is just so... It just feels like sparkly and vibrant and beautiful and heavenly and not like our own world, which I know for a lot of us when we pick up fantasy, that's one of the things we love, is to kind of imagine these settings that are almost like those wallpapers or those custom prints that you can get and the artwork that people do, entire art books dedicated to just these beautiful fantasy lands. It's like if you took that and then wrote a story within one of those settings, and I know for a lot of us that is something that we really, really love. So the setting is exceptional. As for the setup of the story, I do think if you're somebody who likes the idea of a romance in your fantasy and you don't mind the idea of it playing a decent role in the story, but you don't necessarily want fantasy romance where the entire point of the book is these two characters getting together and it's maybe really angsty and it's really heated all the time and it's very centered on their attraction and their tension. If you're like, I don't mind sprinkles of that, but I also want a plot and I want more of the fantasy, I think this is the distinction that people are making when they say fantasy romance versus romantasy, where fantasy romance is meant to be, if I'm understanding correctly, a romance with a fantasy setting. Something similar would be historical romance, where it's a romance but with a historical setting, versus romantasy, which is where you have a fantasy story that has a prominent romantic plotline. I think that that is a decent way to describe this story. The setup is that you follow this young woman who recently took over after something happened to some family members of hers. So now she has come into a lot of power. And within their kingdom, they are essentially protected by the celestial beings. But I'm using air quotes because while, yes, in the past, the celestial beings were able to keep them safe from what are basically like these celestial monsters, we'll say, they've kept them safe, but now they have made it so that this group of humans owes them constantly, and our main character wants to have her reign be the time that all of this ends, where they are no longer essentially occupied and they have this debt to these celestial beings, because this debt is going to go on indefinitely. The celestial beings live for eternity, basically. They're immortal, whereas our main character is a human, as are all the people that she rules over. And so while the celestial beings think that not that much time has passed, we're protecting you, and also when we protected you in the past, in their mind it wasn't that long ago, but human beings recognize that their entire existence can go by and they will never really see themselves free from the celestial beings. So our main character at the beginning is meant to go to the celestial kingdom to essentially vow to serve, and she wants to use this opportunity to actually say, how about we don't? She does it much more tactfully than that, but she's essentially going to argue her case as to why she doesn't think that they should have to serve them any longer. And while she is staying there, her host is this individual who serves the queen of the immortals. And this individual is somebody who she just finds herself feeling attraction toward, but she also hates them because of certain things that they represent and certain things she has known them to do or she thinks they have done. But this person seems very interested in her in ways she doesn't really understand, and so you're kind of exploring that relationship. And I did feel like it delivered in the romantasy department. I felt like there was tension and angst, but it wasn't necessarily the only quality to the story. There was a lot of other things. As noted, I actually started by talking about the setting because I thought the setting was exceptional. I like this author's writing, certainly. And there is a trope that I want to mention, but I fear it's a little bit of a spoiler to say what it is. So I know this is going to be kind of annoying, but there is a trope that I don't typically necessarily love when it comes to romances and stories. But I felt like this author did this trope in a way that I did like. So what you can kind of, the dilution of that statement is basically to say this author delivered on tropes. It didn't feel like, oh, we're just inserting this for marketing purposes or because this is on trend or something like that. It felt like it was actually a significant part of the plot and that it was developed and that you had foreshadowing and there were things in place so that when you got the reveal, it felt like it really made sense to the story. Overall, I enjoyed this one. I think that I have similar kind of concluding thoughts, which is that I enjoyed Ambessa Chosen of the Wolf. I enjoyed Immortal. I felt they both delivered as far as being fantasy standalones. I think they delivered well on what they were representing themselves to be. Neither of these were the kind, though, that I felt emotionally gutted by or devastated by, or like this was, oh my gosh, I'm going to shout from the rooftops. Once again, thematically, I don't necessarily think these ones were driven by the themes, but I enjoyed both of these quite a bit. Now for Grave Empire. So this was one of my most anticipated releases of the year, especially because I finally wrapped up the Empire of the Wolf trilogy by this author, and that trilogy I really enjoyed as it was coming out. It was really exciting for each new installment, and I really, really loved the blend of fantasy and horror within that story. I was really looking forward to what this author was going to do next. I tried to avoid saying too much about Grave Empire. I didn't know before I went in if it's too connected to his other world, meaning not too connected, but I mean that I didn't know if it was going to be so connected that you had to read the Empire of the Wolf trilogy before. This particular series is The Great Silence, is the name of it. So I wasn't sure if it was going to be really connected where you had to read that or not. I just went into it excited to get more of this author's writing and also be in this world once again. This is taking place a decent amount after the events of the Empire of the Wolf, and you definitely don't have to read Empire of the Wolf to read this. I always, in talking about the other trilogy, talked about how I'm not even really somebody who reads a lot of horror, but I really felt like the genre bender quality to the Empire of the Wolf trilogy was fantastic. I felt like it was even better. I don't know what anybody else thinks. I avoided seeing basically anybody else's thoughts about it. And in my opinion, I really thought that this author unleashed their gift at combining fantasy and horror. And for the longest time, I kind of stupidly didn't know how to describe the horror elements within the Empire of the Wolf trilogy, because I'd be like, it's not like, I don't know, it's more existential, I guess, I suppose. And I didn't know how to talk about it for a couple reasons. One, I'm not well versed in horror, which I have no problem admitting. But second, I didn't want to spoil certain plot elements to that story, because I do feel like the horror elements become more and more prevalent as you progress through that trilogy. And I now have kind of looked into it. Eldritch horror. That's how to describe the horror in this. And I do want to kind of throw something out to all of you. If you have more insight into Eldritch horror or something that you want to comment, feel free to do so. But also, if you have more recommendations for books that you feel like represent this, especially fantasy works and potentially even more modern fantasy works, because maybe I'm just out of the loop when it comes to this sort of subgenre of fantasy, but I like it. And I kind of want more of it. So if you do have some recommendations, feel free to let everybody know, but also selfishly let me know, because I want to check them out. Now, I do want to get into the official synopsis and everything, and I know this is goofy, I do want to make note that I have the Broken Binding edition, which isn't the thing I wanted to focus on necessarily, but I do want to make known, based off of the way it looks, because I know a lot of you also really love Broken Binding, and a lot of you have seen these editions, so the naked hardback really ups the marine quality to the story, and there being these merfolk. And they were certainly a part of the story, but I don't want anybody to get the wrong expectation from the presentation of the book. Once again, they are a part of the story, but that's it. They're a part of it. They're not the focus. This isn't a seafaring tale or anything like that. So I just wouldn't want somebody to go in expecting that to be what it is and then be disappointed. You follow a couple of different perspectives. One of them, and the one that is more so tied to the merfolk, is this woman who is studying them, and she has the opportunity to actually go to them and sort of argue their case, because from their understanding, there seems to be a silence coming from the afterlife. There aren't too many people that have a whole lot of awareness about the afterlife, and they're not even really supposed to try and have any kinds of portals into the afterlife, because in the original trilogy, once again, you don't have to read the original trilogy, but you do see the consequences of that. And because this takes place quite a bit later, they have a lot of restrictions. However, there are some people who have gone against what those restrictions are, and they do try to keep in touch, we'll say, with the beings of the afterlife. And beings of the afterlife have gone quiet. So these people very fearfully kind of come to them and say, I know typically we would get in trouble, but this feels like it's significant for basically the entire world. It seems to be a serious problem that we're not hearing anything. And we don't know what the threat is, but it definitely feels like there's something. So our main character, being somebody who has some level of expertise when it comes to the merfolk, she is now going to sort of represent an ambassador role, her and this other individual that she works with. And they're going to try to communicate with the merfolk to try and see if maybe they have more of an idea of what's going on, because they're not exactly human, and they have their own connections to beings of the afterlife. So you have that as a perspective. Then another perspective you get is this character who is a soldier who is stationed in this one place in this horribly humid, swampy, forested area, and this is where immediately you're like, I see the horror elements, because they just hear sobbing and crying and screaming in the middle of the night. They have no idea where it's coming from or what it is, and nobody really wants to talk about it, and everybody's having these weird nightmares. And then they have to go out to try and figure out something that's been happening. There seems to be rumors of there being some kind of plague or illness, so they're going out to try and investigate. And just this descent into the forest is so well done, and it was so creepy. So many instances, so many scenes really, really stood out. Then you have another character who actually has a somewhat similar plot line, in that they also are trying to investigate something that's going on, and they're kind of going to certain locations. And once again, there are really horrifying scenes that occur where you're like, what is even happening? And sometimes you don't know, is the character hallucinating? Is this really happening? What's going on? And that character, this other perspective, I don't remember the last time that I hated a character like I hated this character, in a way that they're clearly written to be an awful human being. And it's the closest that I can think of in recent memory to a mustache twirling, like close to mustache twirling level villain, except for well written. So not cartoonish, but just barely bordering on it. Maybe some people will feel like they're too over the top, but this particular character, everything about them, as soon as you're introduced to them, you're like, I hate this guy. I hate this guy. And the more you get about them, you're like, oh yeah, no, they're basically true evil. This is a horrible human being. And to follow a character like that alongside the other perspectives that you get was fascinating. And in a weird way, you're like, this character is basically true evil, but are they going to be needed for their fight against this eldritch horror antagonist? I don't know. Maybe. I think they might be. Or they're going to represent it. I don't know. And I just loved how everything played out. I thought it was amazing. One thing that I suppose is maybe almost like a personal critique. It's not even really a critique. It's more of just something that I found to be true of now 4 books that I've picked up by this author. There's something about sometimes the stakes within individual scenes I don't really feel as strong as I would like. And I've been trying to pinpoint why. And I think it's because this is something I see within, as an example, the Witcher series as well. It really feeds into the setting exceptionally. However, I also feel like it does play into why sometimes I don't always feel as invested in certain moments. So you have characters that are trying to get from point A to point B. And in the meantime, obviously, they're traveling and they're going from one place to the next on their way to get to their destination. And sometimes there's something occurring that is dangerous from point A to point B. And sometimes those dangerous things are, there's a fight, there's a battle, and our characters are suddenly kind of caught up in it. And the reason I say that I think this fits well into the setting is because it establishes this is a very war-torn land. Everybody's always vying for power, and there's violence everywhere. And I think that that makes it so that it's a dangerous quest, you could say, going from point A to point B. However, whenever they're kind of caught up in a fight that's occurring that is not necessarily relevant to them, I don't really know the stakes for the parties on either side. I just know, oh, our characters are trying to get away or trying to get out of this. And when I read the Empire of the Wolf trilogy, I sometimes, because I was reading installments as they came out, I thought, maybe I have some more insight into this and I've just maybe forgotten a little bit because I picked up the first one when it came out, and now I'm picking up the second one. But now, having read 4 books, I'm like, no, I think this is just a thing that occurs. Because this is the first book in a series. It's not like there's anything I was supposed to know that I forgot. I think it's just a matter of one of the consequences of those types of stories. And once again, I'm not trying to say this is a formal criticism or a weakness of the writing or anything like that. But I do feel like, for my personal taste, whenever there is action and the kind where you're seeing people fighting, I usually prefer if our characters have some kind of role within those scenes. It's not like it's the whole book or anything like that. It's just happened a few times. And in those moments, I'm kind of like, I hope everybody gets out of this safely. I don't really know if I care who wins or loses in those fights because it's not really relevant to the characters and what they're trying to do. It's just a roadblock that comes up. I do want to make note, though, I do think there are some authors that know how to make you more invested in those things, but it's such a minor critique, you could say, that it's really not a big deal. It's just one of those things that came up that maybe kept this from being something where I loved every second. There were some where I'm like, I'm looking forward to when this scene, it's well written, but I kind of want to know what was going on with the like creepy, scary stuff in that other perspective. So sometimes my interest in certain perspectives were stronger than in others. But anyway, Grave Empire was fantastic. I really thought it was fantastic. I can't wait for the next one. Really, really hated that guy. I loved how much I hated that guy. Thought the horror elements were fantastic. Can't wait for book 2. But anyway, that's it for some new fantasy books that have come out recently. As stated before, I'll have links to these in case you'd like to check any of them out for yourself, and any other relevant videos I'll have in the description bar as well. If you have any thoughts on these books, or in the case of Grave Empire, if you have more recommendations for Eldritch horror fantasy books, feel free to leave those. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.